You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi. And this week we are in the Haftarah of Shemot. We've started a new book, the book of what's called Exodus in English. And in Hebrew it's called Haftarah Shemot. It's also the first words of the book, Ve'ele Shemot B'nei Yisrael Mitzrayma. These are names, so Shemot really stands for, it's a plural for names. And this week's Haftarah, we actually have multiple possible readings. This is not one of those cases where there's one tradition of reading. There's actually multiple traditions of readings on this one. And I decided to go on something I think most people out there have not done episodes about. There are different people who have done Haftarah series. I've chosen to go to one of the more slightly exotic ones because it's a very, very small community. But there's a few reasons why I went with this one, and I'll explain in a moment. First of all, you can probably hear some of the rain in the background, especially the trickling of rain. We actually have right now a storm here in Israel, which is always a great blessing, though usually around the coastal plain, it can get really flooded. I live in the more northern part, a little bit more inwards, so I have less of a danger of that. But very interestingly, historically speaking, the coastal plain area was always considered to be a bit of a dangerous area to live in during the winter. That and the desert area, you can actually go to the area of the Dead Sea and see the floods there. It's actually pretty spectacular. There was one year I actually got to see it firsthand. I went to the area of Nachal David. So if you're ever visiting Israel during the winter and you want to see something pretty interesting, you can actually go to the desert, to the area of En-Gedi, Nachal David, all that area of the dry area during the summer, and then it floods during winter. Flash floods, this way you have to be very, very careful, but a lot of people go out to see these things. And I remember traveling down that road and seeing it, which was still pretty amazing, even though I only had a few minutes to watch because I had to go somewhere else. And what's very interesting historically as well regarding the area of what's known as the Sharon of today, which is basically the central coastal plain, is there's a tradition that says that the high priest would pray during Yom Kippurim. One of the prayers that he would say was that the houses of the people who live in that area would not become their tombs. And what he was really talking about was the fact that sometimes they'll have floods there, and houses could collapse because these were not necessarily built high up, so houses could collapse and people could get buried inside the houses or flooded and drown. And unfortunately, stuff like that happened, and this is why he would pray about this specifically. So every year we see these things, and it reminds me of this prayer. So historically speaking, we can see something from the past also happening today. And specifically in this storm, there was a flood in the Sharon area, and they had to get people out of their houses. There were rescue teams going through. Now, this week's Haftarah, as I said, there's something very unique. There are three distinct, separate traditions of what to read. And Sephardic Jews, meaning North African and Eastern, usually read from Jeremiah 1:1 to Jeremiah 2:3. I am not going to read that one, and there's a very simple reason, because I already covered this one in a previous reading, which was during the three the three readings before the 9th of Av, the three readings of destructive prophecies. So the only ones we're really left with are from the Ashkenazi tradition, European tradition, which is from Isaiah 27:6 all the way to 28:13, and usually traditionally adding 22 to 23 to end with something a little bit happier. I personally want to do the Yemenite tradition. I have a personal affinity with the Yemenite traditions. For a very long time, I used to pray in the Yemenite synagogue. I learned the Yemenite traditions. I learned their accent. That actually was one of the things that led me into studying biblical Hebrew in a much more advanced level, understanding the grammar, understanding the pronunciation of everything. And that's what led me into becoming who I am. It's one of the things that led me to becoming who I am today, which is, besides a Bible scholar, also a Hebraist, even though I don't know everything about Hebrew. It's a fact. And I actually don't know too many Hebraists who know everything. I've had cases where I've sat with Hebraists and there were these awkward moments where I knew something and they didn't know, and vice versa. So we always share information. That's why sharing opinions, sharing information is always very, very useful. And this is a very important thing that has to be pointed out, that the fact that I have an opinion doesn't mean I'm always right, and the fact that someone else has an opinion doesn't mean they're always right. This is the whole idea of sharing ideas, sharing opinions, and unfortunately, sadly, people take sometimes very strong stances on their opinions to a point where it's very difficult to have a dialogue. And unfortunately, I had to deal with stuff like this on a regular basis, because I sometimes explain things which are outside of someone's understanding, and it happens. But it doesn't matter. People who want to learn will always listen. Those who don't want to learn won't listen. And this is part of what these prophecies actually are about. These three prophecies are actually negative prophecies about being stiff-necked, about not listening. And I think the reason each tradition went with something else is because each one of them felt something a little different about it. So the Sephardic Jews went for the Jeremiah. Jeremiah actually ends, the reading from Jeremiah actually ends with 2:3, which are actually something very, very positive about God does not abandon His people, even though He's saying he's giving prophecy to Jeremiah about destruction. He still points out to the fact that He still loves Israel. Ashkenazi Jews also talk about being stubborn, especially the last words of Isaiah or Ishayahu 28:13. V'nukshu v'nilkadu. Nokash is from the word. It's actually connected to the idea of being entrapped, but he does go over this whole description of being stubborn and so on. What's very interesting is that the Yemenites kind of cut off the prophecy in the middle, because the prophecy starts off with negative, carries on into the positive description, but then cuts it off before he goes into the negative description. And there's something very unique about the language of Ezekiel. So what I'm going to talk about right now is I'm going to leave alone now these two other traditions, and I'm going to talk about Ezekiel here for a moment. So first of all, we have to remember that Ezekiel is a Kohen, okay? And which means that from an academic point of view, we usually look at him as someone who shares a lot of the language of the priestly thought. Now, it's important to remember that Jeremiah was also a Kohen, and we would expect some priestly language with him. And there is a little bit, but what's very interesting is a lot of his language actually reminds us a lot of Deuteronomy, and it's a very, very common feature that you'll hear. Ezekiel, on the other hand, shares a lot of features with the book of Leviticus, with the book of Vayikra. And what makes it really interesting is that he chooses a lot of marriage metaphors and a lot of sexuality metaphors. Now, this is not surprising because the book of Leviticus does have 2 entire chapters that deal with sexuality, or specifically sexuality, sexual taboos. And Ezekiel is a type of prophet that really doesn't cut back on the language. Though we're not going to be reading this, I was actually I was hesitant because I saw what chapter I have to read through, and I was like, no, this is a pretty intense chapter to talk about. And there's 2 chapters. There's this one, and there's another one later on. I think it's 20 or 21. The other one is about the two sisters, Ohaliva and Oholivama, and this one still is a very, very, very intense prophecy. It is something so intense. I remember the first time I read it, even without knowing the entire language, I felt very, very uncomfortable reading it because the language is extremely harsh. It is very explicit, very harsh, very upfront about his thoughts about the iniquities of Israel being compared to an unloyal woman in a sexual manner. It's a very difficult chapter to read when you really fully understand all the words that he uses here. But what the Yemenites did is very interesting. They preferred to start the prophecy as is, with the attack, with the opening that attacks Israel, but then talk about the good things that God did to Israel. So they were maintaining, if I go back for a second to the other readings, they were maintaining the idea of the stubbornness, but focusing on the good things which God did to Israel when Israel came out from Egypt. And there's a few really interesting statements in this reading which we're going to have to stop and think about for a moment. But the connection, because usually Haftarot usually have a connection to the reading, and I think the connection here specifically is that Israel were not willing to listen. When Moses came up, he went to Pharaoh. Pharaoh made everything much more difficult. Israel wouldn't listen because of all the workload that was put on them, and this is really the theme that's being played off of here. But the Yemenite tradition just preferred to focus more on the idea of God saving Israel, and this is why the reading actually gets cut off in verse 14. So we start off from verse 1, it goes all the way to verse 14. So it's a relatively short reading, but it's packed with a lot of really interesting ideas. And a lot of what we see here is a birth metaphor, the birth of Israel, marriage with Israel. There's some language here which I will have to explain some of the terminology used here. Some of it might not be necessarily 100% fitting for children, so maybe some of this, if you do let your kids listen to my recordings, maybe this one either cut out, or unless the child is old enough, or you don't keep certain things away from your children, then that's up to you. I remember when I was in school. Interesting thing. When I was in school, we never touched the book of Leviticus until we reached around the area of 5th grade. So anywhere between 10, 11 years old, because the schools felt, and the educational boards felt, that Leviticus has some themes in it that would not be fully understood by children, by very young children, and some of it was actually cut out. Even especially chapters 18 and 20 were kind of cut out from our discussions. Because of the theme, and we only returned to it when somewhere around the 8th or 9th grade. We go back to Leviticus. I've explained this before, but I'll explain again because some people might be new to the recordings. This may be the first one they listen to. Biblical studies, studying Tanakh, not biblical studies in the academic sense, but Tanakh is mandatory here in Israel. It's part of the identity of being an Israeli, and it's part of the identity of being Jewish. So Tanakh is mandatory. Hebrew is mandatory as well. You cannot finish high school here in Israel without actually studying Hebrew as well. But it doesn't make you a Hebrew expert. There's always this problem that I bump into people, even at the university, that they're reading Tanakh, and these are people doing their masters, but they don't really know biblical Hebrew. I actually had a really funny moment in class where I actually had to correct a lot of people on what something means, because I understand biblical Hebrew, I know biblical Hebrew, but they don't understand the entire structure. And the professor who was teaching us had to deal with this as well. He had to kind of confirm and explain why the sentence is not what they think it is. So it's not uncommon. Even if you learn Hebrew in high school here in Israel, you only learn it up to a certain level, and you don't really focus on biblical Hebrew. So knowing Hebrew as a spoken language, or even learning it at school, is not enough to really be a Hebrew expert. This is why when you want to learn biblical Hebrew, you should always seek someone who specifies in biblical Hebrew, or someone who is a Hebraeus and knows the different layers of the Hebrew language. This is also a reminder, I have articles about Hebrew on my website. I do offer Hebrew lessons if you're interested, even though right now I'm fully booked, and with school, with my master's leading, hopefully one day, hopefully immediately after it, to a PhD. I find myself very, very busy. So right now I don't really have any room, because people send me emails every once in a while. But still, you can feel free to ask me questions. I have people send me emails about verses, about words, about even in modern Hebrew. It's perfectly fine. That feel free to send to me. But right now, biblical Hebrew, I'm kind of full. But please remember, this is in the recording. I'm doing this recording in 2018. If you listen to this recording in 2023, maybe it's worthwhile listening. Try to contact me. But in any case, the thing that happens here is that we have a lot of terminology of real terminology, a realistic description of what is done with children when they're born. So it's a really interesting thing to read because we don't have a lot of entries about medicine in the Bible. We only have a few here and there. And here we actually read about childbirth. We read about what happens with a child when they're born. So there's a lot of interesting realism inside this description, even though the intent of the description is to demonstrate the idea that God showed mercy to Israel when he found them. And this is a really interesting idea of he found them, and not that he pre-planned the birth of Israel. But we need to think about the metaphor of finding, because they were in Egypt for a very, very long time. And it's probably trying to play off of the idea that they felt that God abandoned them. And now God is as if he rediscovers them. And he tells Israel, listen, you were abandoned. No one took care of you. You were in exile in Egypt. I wasn't really there for you at the time, even though I was watching over the whole time. So it's playing off of that theme of the idea of finding an orphan in the middle of nowhere. And really, I mean, because when you play around with this with academics, they might say this to be a different tradition of what happened with Israel. But I would say that this is more of an adoption description, finding someone who has no parents, a lonely person, and adopting them as their own child, or in this case, an adoption that also turns into a marriage. And what he's really trying to describe here is the idea that Israel is the child of God from a male-female perspective specifically, and that Israel eventually marries God. There's very precise references to sexuality in this chapter, but there's the ones what we're going to be reading. I'll point it out, and you could just complete some of the details in your head by yourself. But the idea here is not a different tradition what happened with Israel. It's more an idea of adoption of Israel, marriage of Israel, and then unfortunately Israel abandoning that marriage, betraying that marriage. But we're not going to be really reading this one. So in the beginning here, Ezekiel actually points out to something really, really, really unusual, something very, very surprising, I would say. Where he kind of talks about Israel being taken from not taken, but the descendants of certain peoples, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of the description in Amos 9, where it says, "Haloch yivnechu shi'im atem li bnei Yisrael ne'um Adonai," for you are like the sons of Cush to me, the children of Israel, says the Lord. Halot Yisrael ha'eleti meretz Mitzrayim u'Flishtim mikaftor ve'aram mikir. For I brought out from the land of Egypt, for Israel I brought out from the land of Egypt, and Philistines from Kaftor, and Aram from Kir. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of the language used here, because when you read this, it sounds as if there's some kind of alternate version here of the history of Israel. But in truth, what's being said here is that God has intervened in the histories of peoples, and we get a very similar idea played here, where God redeems Israel from Egypt, but he kind of points out that there's a very important issue here, that Israel has to remember that being chosen doesn't mean you override everything that surrounds you. You have to still remember that you're still a person, you still are a descendant of some nations, and even being chosen you have to remember that being chosen is also a responsibility. And this is really part of the theme of the prophecy. So if we start reading, we start with something very, very negative, and then it goes into actually a pretty, I would say, beautiful description, and then it turns very, really bad. And I have to point out, this is a very, very, very long chapter. It's 63 verses long. We're only going to be reading 14 verses. We're going to be skipping a lot of the what we call guts and gore of this chapter. But the opening itself makes a very, very important point about remembering that being an Israelite still, it doesn't make you better than others. What it means is you've been chosen, and being chosen means you have to take the responsibility, and you have to be loyal to the covenant given to you. Because other than that, so you're just another human being. And that's something that's very important to remember. So it says here, Vahi devar Adonai elai lemon, the word of the Lord was to me, saying, Ben Adam, son of man, human, mortal. It's a very interesting discussion of why he's referred to as Ben Adam throughout the entire description. The traditional interpretation is that because he actually saw the chariot of God, he saw the upper existence of reality, and he was able to see, he describes things that many others don't describe. He has to be reminded that he's not part of the angelic world, he's actually a human being, and that he needs to understand this. So it's a very interesting discussion why he's referred to as Ben Adam, as son of man, or human, or mortal. I've seen different translations of this specific use. And it seems pretty appropriate because unlike most of the prophets, he's the only one that really has a very, very, very detailed description of something that's completely outside of our realm. The only other prophet that we have something which is kind of close to it is Isaiah, Yeshayahu in chapter 6, but there he sees God in the temple sitting on his throne. Here, what Ezekiel sees is the chariot of God, which includes many types of angels and beings and stuff like that, something no one else actually describes. It says, Hoda et Yerushalayim ta'avotea. Let it be known, let her know, let Jerusalem know all its disgraces, all its foul behavior. Va'amartani will say, Ko amar Adonai Elohim liYerushalayim. Thus says the Lord God to Jerusalem. For those who remember, when you have the combination of Adonai followed by Yud He Vav He, was supposed to be read as Adonai, and then Yeho, or whatever pronunciation a person prefers. And because we don't read the name, reading Adonai will be redundant, so it gets replaced with the word Elohim, which is not unusual because we also know that the name of God was replaced in some Dead Sea Scrolls, in some Psalms, with the word Elohim. So it's not strange that specifically the word Elohim was chosen, because this was something that was done very, very, very early on. I think I've spoken about this in other places, but maybe there should be an opportunity where I actually talk a little bit more about the history of what happened exactly with the name, why the name is not spoken, where that practice actually started. And no, it's not what you think it is. It's actually it's a lot different than what people think. It has nothing to do with rabbis or anything. You know what? Now's an opportunity. Let's bring this up. Let me talk about this for 2-3 minutes. So a lot of people talk about the prohibition from a rabbinic perspective, which is somewhat true. Yes, we need to remember that the avoidance of using the name is something which is mostly attested and mostly discussed in rabbinic sources. However, in studies of compared texts of the Bible, and even cases in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we actually see from very, very early on, assuming that, for example, some Psalms were written in the second Temple era, and we have parallel verses that sometimes appear in Chronicles parallel to other places, and also some scribal practices that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's an avoidance of using the name. There's a question about writing the name in Paleo-Hebrew. There are scrolls where it's written in Paleo-Hebrew, and that by itself is a really interesting discussion. My approach and the approach of many other scholars that I've spoken with is that they wrote it in Paleo-Hebrew being around script which resembles around the 8th century BCE, not what people mistakenly call Paleo-Hebrew, which is Proto-Sinaitic, which is pictographic. It has nothing to do with Paleo-Hebrew. That's known as Proto-Sinaitic. It's actually a dialect of Canaanite, even though most of it hasn't been deciphered. I've actually heard multiple archaeologists and specialists and everything say it's very clear this is a Canaanite dialect, and it's never read as actual pictographs. I've actually sat with a lady called Professor Gilboa from the Haifa University, and I actually specifically asked her, and she said, no, this is read as an alphabet. There's no doubt about it. And and so they wrote in what's more like 8th century, 7th century Paleo-Hebrew, which is more of an alphabetic system. And then I personally understand that's actually supposed to be a representation in a holy sense, because if, for example, you write something else, or you write Yud Hey Vav Hey with square letters, they might have felt that that was not the original representation of the name. And what's very interesting, some of the very early manuscripts we have of Greek translations, like, for example, the original Unkelos, or the Achilles translation to Greek, I think his name is called in English Aculus or something like that. And even the Sumachos translation, they actually put the name in Paleo-Hebrew. Instead of trying to translate it into Greek or something like that, they actually wrote in Paleo-Hebrew, which is very interesting. But the practice itself of not using the name seems to be, for example, according to Professor Sarah Yefet, who studied actually the Persian era. She's known as the Chronicles lady. She points out that we can actually see in Psalms that can be easily, which are reproductions of earlier Psalms during the Second Temple era, and even in the Book of Chronicles, where usually the Yud Hey Vav Hey appears, the word Elohim appears. So it seems to be that this was some piousness or pious behavior that was adopted during the Second Temple era for some reasons. There's different theories why it actually specifically started, but this is way before scribes, way before rabbis or anyone. Now, because scribes were the ones writing these books, and they were probably connected to Ezra the scribe and overall, and were probably the beginning of the Pharisaic movement before we actually get Pharisees and rabbis, and then the sages, the rabbinic sages, and so on. This is something that starts off before them, but it's probably with the predecessors of the Pharisees. And people probably felt uncomfortable using the name, maybe out of fear of the name and things like that. And there are even scrolls, especially if these are not biblical scrolls, when there's no actual quotation of a verse, the name is replaced by 4 dots. So this is a practice that apparently was much more widespread than we realized during the Second Temple. It probably crossed different groups and people avoiding using the name. And this wasn't something that rabbis made up. This was actually something that came much, much earlier. There is some literature about this. Specifically, Sarah Yefet, I recommend. She has a book that she wrote about. I don't think she's alive anymore as far as I remember, but she did write a book about the Book of Chronicles. Again, Sarah Yefet, or Sarah, I think she writes it in English with a J, so Japhet or something like that, PH, if I'm not mistaken. And she has an entire chapter there where she deals with the issue of the God of Israel, Israel and God, and the name. Really worthwhile reading. So in any case, so the practice of replacing, saying Adonai Elohim, is based on a much, much, much older practice of replacing the name with the word Elohim. So it's nothing special or something that the Masoretes invented or even rabbis invented. This is something much, much earlier than that. So carry on from verse 3. Mechorotayich umolotayich me'eretz ha'kenaani, avicha emori ve'emech Hittit. So it says, your origins, machotayich umolatech, and your place of birth, from the land of the Canaanite, your father the Amorite and your mother the Hittite. Now, what is he really saying here? You have to remember, you are no different than the rest of the nations. Okay, he mentions Knaani, Emori, and Chiti, actually kind of going from south to north to west. Canaan is land of Israel today. Amuru was westerners, kind of like Syria, southern Lebanon, Syria, northern Israel. Chittim, Anatolia, Asia Minor in the west. But he's really trying to tell them that you are really, no different. Now, mentioning the idea of Knaani, also kind of, and Emori reminds a little bit about the Jebusites, Yevusim, which were the original inhabitants of Jerusalem. The Canaanites who founded Jerusalem were from the Jebusites, according to the biblical tradition, especially the Book of Joshua and the Book of Judges. So he's telling Jerusalem, your origins is from these Canaanite groups, but it's also referring to Israel, saying, listen, you are peoples from Mesopotamia that I chose your father, but you are still humans. You are still part of the larger culture that surrounds you. What makes you unique is that you're loyal to me. If without your loyalty to me, you're nothing. You're just another group of people. And he says, "Umolataich bayom huledet otach lo charat sharech." This is a very interesting verse. There's a grammatical issue here. So, and your birth, on the day of your birth, was not cut off your sharech. Sharech is actually a term we only see once, I think, as far as I know. Except for one more time, should be in the Song of Songs, chapter 7, verse 3, in a slightly different version. It's written sherarech, with two resh. Here, lo charat sharech. Notice I stressed more the resh. Is actually, if you look at the Masoretic text, there's a dagesh, which is a dot, which is very unusual for resh, because usually resh doesn't get a dot, but there's a few cases where it does. And it's supposed to indicate a duplication of the resh. And what's interesting is if you actually go to that reference in the Song of Songs 7:3, it's written with two resh. Here it's written with one. But he says not cut off your umbilical cord. So this is connected to the idea of the area of the stomach, the umbilical cord connected to the stomach. It says, when I found you, your umbilical cord wasn't even cut, which tells us a little bit about how they called the umbilical cord, but also how they, what was part of the medical procedure, cutting the umbilical cord, apparently, and it's that it fall off. They cut it off. This has been a medical procedure for thousands of years. It says, Uvamayim lo ruchatz lemish'i, and he will not washed completely, cleansed completely. The mish'i is like completely cleansed. Usually when someone's shaven lemish'i, means that they're completely clean shaved. So mish'i means to be clean. We were not cleaned completely with water. Vahamlech lo humlacht. He will not rub with salt. This was another procedure that he was used to remove any dirt or anything, and he also will sanitize the baby's skin, and also strengthen the skin a little bit. So this wasn't done to her as well. And he were not diapered. He were not actually placed inside with a diaper. But really what he's referring here is to do more with tying down the limbs of the baby. So today we use the term diaper, and diapers are supposed to hold, it's not just to collect dirt, as babies do, human beings as adults as well, but also what they used to do, they used to tie the baby up a little bit to keep the limbs in place so they don't fracture, they don't hurt themselves, and they're all bundled up. Notice, for example, many cases, actually almost always when you go to the hospital, the baby's bundled up and given to the parents as a bundle and not as a free moving baby. And this is again going back to a very, very old practice of bundling up the baby, keeping the baby together. And it's really to make sure the limbs are in place, everything is straightened out and so on, to make sure that the head moves back into its place, the spine is straight, so there's no damage to the baby after they're born. But then he says you were abandoned. He says, I found you abandoned. And he says, Velo chasa alayich ayin lasot lach achat me'ele lahumla alayich. No, I showed mercy towards you to do to you or any one of these to show mercy, to show compassion to you. And you were thrown on the surface of the field, basically abandoned, with the despise of you, with the despise towards you on the day you were born. Now, this is a very interesting thing because this practice of gathering babies, of finding a baby, for example, you walk down the road, people sometimes used to abandon babies because they couldn't take care of them, hoping someone else will find them. And what's very interesting is amongst Israelites, this was never considered to be something okay, to such an extent that the Greeks were horrified by the fact that Jews would never abandon a child. That Jews always had kept all their children, and Jews always would even adopt children if they find them. And in the Greek world, when a person had a child that they didn't want, they just abandoned them, hoping maybe someone will find them. Maybe someone, especially, for example, there were a lot of cases of abandoning girls because people were not only boys. So girls were found and adopted by a family or raised by someone and then married them. And Jews never did this. And this is, you actually find criticism in Greek writings about Jews have all their children. This was inconceivable to the Greeks. But abandoning children was something that was practiced, especially in cases where it would bring disgrace to a family. That one is less known to me as factual, but I think I think it did exist, but that's mostly speculation. But we do know that in cases of if there wasn't enough food in the family or there was some difficulty or something, children would have been abandoned, which is a horrible thought, but it was done because sometimes it was an issue of the child actually might survive better if they abandoned them. And if you actually go to the temple Ramses III, actually the temple of Medinat Chabu, I think it's in Karnak, if I remember correctly. There are actually images there of the sea people abandoning the children off of the sides of chariots because that was a better chance of them surviving from the Egyptian army, so they can flee fleeing to the mountains or flee to the sides of the roads where the Egyptians can't go with their chariots. So this was something that was done to allow children to survive. But he says he's describing this as an even worse situation because this was on the day of birth. This wasn't, say, a couple years down the road or the child can fend for themselves. No, this is a newborn baby. It's like those cases where you hear where someone is going, unfortunately, through a dumpster in, say, some state in America or something, or someone goes by next to a church and they find actually church is still trying to take care of the child, but finding a child in a garbage can or an alleyway somewhere because someone gave birth and didn't want the baby. It's the exact same situation. And he says, "Va'avor alaich," and this is actually a verse that we read during circumcision of a child because it's the covenant of blood. He says, "Va'avor alaich ve'ech mitboseset bedamaich v'omar lach bedamai chayi v'omar lach bedamai chayi." And I passed upon you, I will see you. Mitboseset is to kind of like linger and kind of like move around inside your own blood because it's the blood of the birth. And I will say, with your blood you will live. With your blood you will live. He says to you, I'll help you. I'll help you survive this. And he says to her, so you have to imagine God picking up Israel and taking over and taking care of her. And he says, Revava ketzemach hasadeh netati, I have given you like the tens of thousands of the field, like a grass that grows in massive quantities. This is a reference to the growth of Israel. Vatirbi vatigdeli vetavoy ba'adei adayim. You grew, you multiply, and you grew, and you entered ba'adei adayim, which can be translated in several ways. Here it seems to be ba'adei adayim. You reached an age where wearing jewelry is acceptable. Shadayim nachonu v'sa'arech tzimeach vat erom ve'eria. Your breasts were prepared, were ready. Your hair grew. Think for yourself what that means. And you are naked and by yourself. Okay, so here he's kind of he took care of the baby, but it could be that he's using a separate metaphor here. Now we're not talking about baby. Now we're talking about a woman. Okay, so it's possible that he's talking about two different stages. Like the first stage is maybe the infancy of Israel. When they came out of Egypt and stuff like that, and then maybe again during the times of King David, now Israel is a nation, is structured, is ready for kingship, is ready for God to being their king. So this might be a metaphor for another stage in Israel's history. And he says, "Va'avor alaich," because again he tells her, "You're naked here, you're naked here." So these are probably two separate metaphors, two different stages of Israel. And it says again, "Va'avor alaich ve'ech," I passed upon you and I saw you. And your time is a time of dodim, of love. It's the time of marriage. And I spread my cloak upon you. I spread the side of my garment upon you. This is why, for example, when I got married and we had the wedding ceremony, I wore a talit and I put the side of the talit over my wife. It's part of making her into my wife. And I covered your nakedness. So here he's using this to cover her, but this is also symbolic of marriage. And I vowed to you. And I came in covenant with you. Ne'um Adonai Elohim v'tihili, the word of the Lord God, and you will be to me, and you became mine. You became my wife. So we're seeing here, there's a bit of a dangerous statement here, v'eshavalach. So a lot of people think this actually means you have to make vows in your wedding. And that's a very, very dangerous practice. I usually recommend not to make vows. The idea of God saying, I made a vow here, is I came in covenant with you, because the Torah and the Mount Sinai and the promise to the patriarchs is the vow. Here he's talking probably less into the reality of what marriage was, and more to the promise to the patriarchs, the promise to Israel, the covenant of the Torah. I usually strongly recommend not to take vows, especially vows like till death do us part and stuff like that, because I'm not sure you can actually get out of that. That actually might nullify the possibility of divorce if divorce is necessary. And divorce is a whole subject by itself, which there's a lot of debate over it, especially circles of people that come from more of a Christian background. There's a massive debate about that. I've actually addressed this, if I'm not mistaken, in a video that I made several years back. You can go listen. It's on YouTube. And now we go back to reading about what God did. He goes back to the metaphor of cleaning her. I washed you with water, and I cleaned off your blood from you. And I put upon you oil. Oil was one of the most basic. First of all, the idea of giving oil to a wife is considered to be one of the basic obligations of a husband to his wife. Cosmetics, and this is the most basic cosmetic to keep the skin soft. Valbishech rikma, and I dressed you with rikma, with embroidered clothing. Ven alech tahash, and I placed upon your feet tahash. Tahash is probably from another Semitic word dahshu, which probably is some kind of yellow hide. These were basically tanned skins which were used to make shoes and sandals. Usually reminds a lot of people of the tahash, which is mentioned in the tabernacle, and this might be a reference to the tabernacle, by the way. You have to think about the idea of Albishech Rikma, dressed you with embroidered clothing or colored clothing. Some people relate the word rakam to the Arabic rakama, which has to do with colored clothing. So this might be a reference to the tabernacle and not just clothing. People used to wear very colorful clothing back then. With the tabernacle, especially with the mention of tahash, it relates to the Akkadian dushu, tahashia, tahshiwe. I also sing dachshu in other languages as well. And the idea is basically sheepskin, tan sheepskin, yellow or orange. And people used to make from these sandals. And so this actually, Old Tachash, reminds us a little bit of the tabernacle, which again sends us back to the idea of Yechezkel and his reference to the temple, the reference to priestly language, and so on. V'echbashech shesh, and I placed upon your head shesh, linen. Think about the linen head cover that the priest would wear. V'achasech meshi, and I covered you with silk. Silk is not mentioned as one of the garments of the priest, but some people say that meshi is not necessarily silk, but it's some Egyptian word mashye, which means a beautiful garment, and some people say it's mashia in Hittite, which means a scarf of some sort. Might relate to the idea of the ephod that covers around the shoulder area, chest area, maybe. Va'adech adi, and I placed upon you jewelry. Ve'tenat simidim al yadayich, and I placed bracelets upon your hands. Ve'ravid al geronech, and a necklace. It's usually a large necklace. That actually might be the choshen, because it kind of leans on the chest, same way these big necklaces would be. This is not a shalsheret, this is a ravid. It's a big plate, usually a big solid piece of metal. This might be the choshen. It also has usually wear it with a chain around, so it kind of slightly resembles the choshen. So maybe the meshi is actually the ephod, and the ravid is the choshen. And then he says, Ve'eten nezem al apech. Now we start talking about actual jewelry. Ve'eten nezem al apech. Put a nose ring. I was actually asked multiple times in the past if nose rings are okay according to Torah. And the answer is yes. I mean, women back in the day used to wear plenty of jewelry. Rings and different other things, special belts around the waist and different symbolic things. There was a lot of jewelry back then. And I mentioned this when we're talking about the reading from Isaiah. especially the one from my bar mitzvah. I talk about the jewelry of the bride. Today, a lot of people go on a minimalist type of mentality, but in Eastern culture, especially Mediterranean cultures, dressing up, wearing a lot of jewelry and so on was very, very common. Still very common in some cultures. I can never forget all these elderly Moroccan ladies who get on the bus and they have earrings and chains and they have loads of bracelets on their hands from gold and silver and copper, and it's a very, very, very common theme in the Mediterranean world. It says va'agilim al oznaich, and earrings upon your ears, va'ateret tiferet beroshech, and ateret. And atara is actually a crown. Ateret tiferet, a glorious crown upon your head. Kind of something reminds me of the idea of wearing the tzitz, the high priest garment, one of the vestments he wears. Va'ata'adi zahav v'chesef, and you wore gold and silver. Umalbushech shesh v'meshi v'rikman. He repeats what he said earlier. In your clothing was linen, and this scarf thing, or this kind of beautiful garment, and these colorful garments. Solet vedvash vashemen achalt. You eat fine flour, honey, and oil. Fine flour and oil reminds you a little bit of the sacrifices. Honey, not so much, because it actually says you don't eat, you don't put honey on the altar. There's actually a Kriya and Ktiv situation here. Achalti, I consumed, but it's as if he's quoting her. I have eaten, the woman. I have eaten all these things, but eating fine flour, honey, and oil. Honey and oil is expensive. It makes the food very fatty. So he's talking about eating very, very expensive food, eating a lot of sweet, eating food that's not necessarily what most people would eat in everyday life. Vatifi bim'od me'od, and he became extremely, very, very beautiful. Vatatzlichi limluchan, you were successful, and you were growing up to the point where you could become royalty. Vatatzlichi limlucha, you were successful to become royalty. I actually want to check up exactly the use of vatatzlichi in one of the commentaries. Yeah, you were worthy of marrying into royalty. So this is the last verse we actually have here, and he says to her, "Ve'etzelach Shem b'goim beyofech," and your name went out to the nations because of your beauty. Ki kalilhu, for it is perfect. B'hadari asher samti alayich, and he points out, but by the glory, by the beauty which I have placed upon you, ne'um Adonai Elohim, the word of the Lord God. And he says, you have to remember, this came from me, and this is really what the rest of the chapter deals with. But because the Haftarah try to finish with positive things, we only have 3 Haftarot that focus on bad, negative things. We actually stop here. But the rest of the chapter is a very, very long list of all the bad things that were done. But he points out and he says, look, when you were loyal to me, when I brought you in, when I took care of you, when you were under my wing, you were doing well, you were protected, you were loved, you were well treated, you were well fed, you were dressed properly, you were glorious. Why aren't you doing? Look at this. It reminds me a little bit of Jeremiah, where he says, if you follow me, you'll be successful. And people said, okay, let's try. But they didn't go with a whole heart, and this is why they were still destroyed. But there's a whole series of discussions that we have to have about those chapters in Jeremiah after the destruction of Jerusalem. But he's pointing out a very, very important thing, and he says, your success is because of your loyalty to me. If you're not loyal, there's no success. You just become like the rest of the nations, but even worse, because you become my enemy, because you betrayed me. So it's very, very important to understand the first and foremost, most important thing, before we go into details and before we argue and before we start talking about the exact way of how to do something and what the correct theology is and so on. First of all, loyalty. First of all, be loyal to God. Remember that God took Israel out of Egypt. He took Israel from a state of destruction, from a state of poverty, from the state of being abandoned, and took care and grew and became Israel. But it's only because God took care. He found this abandoned baby, he found this abandoned woman and took care of her, and she became amazing and beautiful. But it's only because God did it. And this is really the message here. He was loyal to us in Egypt. We have to continue to be loyal to him. Generations after he promised to Abraham, he came back and said, I am back, I'm here to take care of you. So I would say it's never too late for us also to turn back and say, we're back, we're here, we'll return to you as well. God is waiting and patient for us to return. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this recording. And again, don't forget to share this with your friends. There are other readings. Remember, you can also read for this Haftarah Jeremiah 1:1-2:3. You can also read Isaiah 27:6 all the way to 28:13 and add chapter 29, verses 22 and 23. Don't forget to share with your friends. Don't forget to go to HebrewInIsrael.net, Hebrew in Israel on Facebook. And if these recordings have been a blessing to you, please consider helping by donating whatever amount you can. It helps me find material, buy material, do the research, and so on. But most importantly, try to learn from this, share your thoughts, maybe have some other interpretations. This is a very metaphorical reading, and therefore there can be different ways of reading such a text. That's probably the most important thing, because for me what's important is for you to understand better and for me to understand better as well. Kol Tov.